Day 540 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzy here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll move across to those Russian losses, as currently Russia is sitting on more than 256,000 military personnel losses, which equates to an additional 480 in the past 24 hours. Then as for Russian hardware losses, 5 tanks, 18 APVs and 17 artillery. Then we'll head back across to the map today and start out in Russia as a metallurgical plant went up in flames in Volgograd today. No word on the cause of the incident, and being that the location is a steel plant of all things, clearly these types of places can have both a civilian and military application value. Then we'll head back to the Donbass in Ukraine today, as this morning a Russian Ka-52 attack helicopter was shot down, and that happened nearabouts to the Bakhmut region. And as you may have noticed, Russian Ka-52s continue to go down at a consistent pace right now, of which I am utterly convinced that the UK-provided Supercats are responsible for these takedowns at this point. And this is just my speculation, but because these highly mobile and recently received platforms into Ukraine employ missiles that can effectively outrange or outdistance the munitions that the Ka-52s have available, giving it the advantage in any potential engagement. And this is a welcome change for the Ukrainian forces, because it was only just a couple of months ago when the AFU were starting to have some real concerns with Russian helicopters becoming quite a threat to Ukrainian vehicles, including their main battle tanks. Then moving along, as precisely 10 kilometers, or about 6 miles due south of Bakhmut, Ukrainian artillery hit and destroyed a large concentration of Russian forces north of Odorivka, which is notably inland from the contact point directly to the west. Then moving down to the Velika Novosilka axis, so Ukrainian troops were successful in their further movements south from the recently liberated settlement of Urozane. And some reports right now suggest that they're even moving further west beyond the river to the next settlement, as indicated by the oinky pig right there. Then moving to the east, a lot of news coming out of Robotian at the moment from both sides, as early reports made mention of progress by the AFU to the around the grey zone area, as you can see here, perhaps actually a little bit further on, because later on updated reports suggested that the AFU presence was inside the town, and that fights have already moved to the centre and the south of the settlement. And during all of these engagements, we also came across this footage of effectively an ammo dump that Russia left behind at the settlement, although it's a bit too fresh and difficult to confirm that's precisely what's going on here. But also, I think it's fairly safe to say what we are actually seeing here is decades-old rusty Russian armor left behind. Oh, then also, the road to Tokmak is said to be under some pretty significant Ukrainian fire control right now, which means that Russian logistics will now be further degraded, thus making it more difficult for Russian forces to support their positions along the contact point, just the main southern axis of attack. But to further summarize what's been happening here right now, there's even been some Striker armored vehicles and even some Challenger 2s spotted near the front on this very southern axis, where it's believed the most powerful AFU brigade has entered the battle, causing this momentum that we now see. Because do note, or remember, large swaths of modernized NATO equipment, of Ukrainian brigades, were actually held in reserve for some time, and likely waiting for that right moment to pounce. Then moving to Kherson, because a bit of action has been happening here as well. So, according to Russian sources, again, there are just not enough resources to counterattack the Ukrainian bridgeheads that have been forming south of the river on the Russian occupied South Bank. As such, those very same Russian sources also advise that they're just trying to contain the AFU elements, all those movements, due to a lack of troops, but also not having enough artillery. No surprises there for Russia. Because when it comes to Kherson, in no place else has Russia actually extended their front lines so far from the motherland, which makes it extremely all the more difficult for them to contend with and defend. Luckily, Russia has the natural obstacle of the Dnieper River there. But even then, in the long term, it's very unlikely to hold back the Ukrainian forces. Then we'll head across to some news for today. So the Finnish border is quote unquote pretty empty of Russian troops, says Alina Valtonen, the Finnish Minister for Foreign Affairs. Now, under normal circumstances, this would be pretty unlikely for a lack of accumulation of Russian troops on the Finnish border, given Finland's recent ascension to NATO, as Russia had an entire year to build up forces on the Finnish border after finding out about Finland's intent and pathway to become a NATO member. But we don't live in normal circumstances, and Russia's lack of commitment to or ability to deploy large numbers of troops to the Finnish border is not surprising, as we've already seen how Russia has been having legitimate issues with providing sufficient manpower to protect its Belgorod and Kursk oblasts that border Ukraine. And I do say manpower with intent, as it's actually volunteer women now performing border forces duties on Russian borders in some instances. But can you really blame Russia for that? After all, they've effectively gone all in on Ukraine at this point. Then in some other news, Russia recently convened an emergency central bank meeting to increase the interest rate all the way up to a whopping 12% to stabilize their degrading ruble currency and counteract inflation. And this was not even some small incremental upgrade to 12%, but in fact it was a jump of 3.5%, previously, of course, at 8.5% in July, which is huge for an economy to deal with and have to go to those lengths. Quite the jump indeed. And this interest rate hike is in response to the destabilizing economy due to many factors, such as Russia's trade surplus as well drastically shrinking, with an increase of 18% increase, that is, in imports and 34% reduction in exports, due to the economic sanctions imposed on the country because of the war in Ukraine. Then in some adjacent economic news, here we have some local news footage from Kuban in Russia, reporting on no gasoline at petrol stations for days now. Because although Russia is one of the largest producers of oil in the world, they still need to prioritize exporting to available export markets for their oil, as they really rely on that incoming cash flow. But also, as with any war, there's always the unquenchable thirst for the refined product, particularly diesel fuel. Oh, and as for a bit of a gaffe, I did notice on this video the signage for octane 92 and 95 and DT, which stands for diesel effectively, but where's the 98 octane premium? A 92 fuel rating is generally for older cars, but hey, maybe all the Russian larders run on that instead. And all in all, as a bit of a summary, it's a bit of a tumultuous period right now for the Russian economy, as you can see. So let's perhaps recap on a few things. So start off with the deficit. So Russia's budget deficit is already at 30 billion in US dollars for the first 8 months of the year, which is quite odd for Russia in previous years to have anything like that value. Also, there's capital outflows. So those capital outflows since February 2022, equal to the amount of $260 billion US dollars. Also, state revenues are down 50% in 2023. Oil and gas revenues are down 42% in 2023. Interest rates went up to 12% from the 8.5% in July, which I mentioned a moment ago. Ruble values against the US dollar are down 39% in just 2023 alone, with similar declines against the yuan, the rupee, and the euro. Also, the sovereign wealth fund of Russia's is down 60% year on year, which now been pretty much depleted, which is an upcoming problem, or fairly problemsome for what it's used for. In many ways, it's used for the retired population. They need to get those retiree checks. Then moving on, the holiday air travel is up around 50%. And lastly, I'll mention here the official inflation rate published by the Russian central bank is 4.4%, which I can't tell you just how much I personally find that figure to be inaccurate. Then in some other news, Shoigu's ex-deputy and one of the Russian commanders in the war against Ukraine, Colonel General Zhidko, died suddenly in Moscow recently at the age of 57 due to some not yet disclosed reasons. But I'll leave all the speculation to you. Then in some other news, Elena Kostuchenko, a Russian journalist working for the Russian independent media outlet Novaya Gazeta, says she was poisoned in Germany after covering Russia's war in Ukraine and has since been recovering quite slowly. But, well, I'll be. So guys, if you ever notice this channel unexpectedly absent with not so much as a goodbye from me, please feel free to treat that one suspiciously, as will my local version of the FBI. But either way, I guess someone would take over the channel anyway. Then moving across to the lighter side of things, so Ukrainian lifting on the front lines with no exercise equipment. And that overhead lift is just bloody impressive. I mean, that dude looks strong, without looking comically jacked, if you know what I mean. Then heading across to another Russian military mobilization blunder segment. So this one, I'll keep it brief today, but in St. Petersburg of Russia, 400 of migrant citizens with foreign citizenship were detained for military registration. Now, these guys actually had dual citizenship status, but the larger point of this story here would be that these types of pretty heinous practices have occurred in Russia before, all in the name of funding any manpower available to continue the war efforts in Ukraine. But also from an economic standpoint, it's pretty tricky signing up your migrant workers for war. After all, they're there to fill the employment gaps for certain industries within the country, and word will just get back to Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and all of the rest from where these migrant workers come from, to simply say, don't go. Which, in my humble opinion, will cause a drying up of migrant workers' inflow into Russia, thus affecting the Russian economy negatively. And I think we can all agree at this point, Russia really doesn't need another issue to add to its existing economic woes. Then, in a final funny to round it all off with today, guys, so Russian Minister Shoigu said today quite a few interesting things, actually. Starting off, he said, the military resource of Ukraine is almost exhausted, which is actually quite bad timing for him to say, given the gains just had there on the south. Also, he said, Russia put an end to Western military dominance. But I would venture to say it's in fact put an end to Russian military dominance. Oh, then there's also, I love this one, Soviet-made equipment is in many cases superior to Western equipment. Soviet equipment? Really? Do I even have to dignify that one with a response? And then there was various other cockamamie responses. But as with most Russian statements of this caliber, you can usually read between the lines and find what's actually true by replacing the word Russia for Ukraine and Ukraine for Russia. And it mostly actually works in making sense. So that's going to be it for today, guys. Thanks for watching. Please leave a comment, subscribe, hit that like button, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers.